without any more delay, let's go talk with Mr. Bielek in Phoenix. And good morning, Alfred Bielek.
Yes.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
I almost don't know where to start. I guess the best thing to do is first find out about you, whatever we can. What is your background, Alfred?
Well, my background as Bielek is I was an electronic engineer. It's for 30 years, from 1958 to 88, but that had no bearing whatever on the Philadelphia experiment and my history with that. The history for the Philadelphia experiment involving not only the USS Eldridge, but some earlier ships in experimentation goes back a long ways. Actually goes back to 1931, when the first experimental considerations of the possibility of making an object invisible were engaged by Dr. Nikola Tesla, Dr. John Hutchinson of the University of Chicago, and a staff physicist by the name of Dr. Emil Kurtenauer, all of whom were at that time at the University of Chicago. Tesla was a man who got around quite a bit, and unlike the stories which have been told about him being a recluse in his little room in the Hotel New York for the last 12 years of his life, that was anything but true. He was very busy, perhaps busier the last 12 years of his life than in the previous period. But these three people were involved in the consideration of how do you make an object invisible. And this is what we would today call a feasibility study, and this took place at the University of Chicago for about 3 years. And at that time, it was moved to the then rather brand new Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey. At that time, it was a think tank, if you will, and it was perhaps the premier think tank of the world, because the initial staffing, which started in 1933, involved people like Dr. John von Neumann, Albert Einstein, Dr. Alexander, and Dr. Oswald Veblen. They were the four original staff members, and many other people came on board at various times after that. Tesla worked with them at the Institute, but he was never a staff member. He was one of the people who came and went, if you will. He was still maintaining a lot of other experimental work, a lot of other jobs he was doing. He was, in fact, a member of the team of RCA Corporation from the day of its inception in 1919 until he retired in 1939. In the last 4 years of his life, he was vice president and director of engineering worldwide for RCA Corporation. It's not a fact that is well known. In fact, it is rather well, shall we say, swept under the rug, because various interests don't want the public to know the position that Tesla actually held.
Al, a lot of the fictional accounts of invisibility, from The Invisible Man, which is a fairly recent movie, to the Philadelphia experiment and a number of others, all seem to deal with very high-energy electromagnetic fields.
That is correct. The original work involved electromagnetics, but it's actually electromagnetics going beyond the range of electromagnetics. And the work, when they transferred it to the Institute in 34, went onward. In 36, they had an experimental test, which is partly successful, but anything but fully successful. Gave them an idea of the fact that they were at least going in the right direction. And by 1940, the Navy, in the meantime, had funded this project almost from the beginning with some research funds from the Office of Naval Engineering.
They were interested from a defense point of view, obviously.
That's correct. Yeah. That is the object. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt was very interested in this project from the beginning because Tesla was an old friend of his. And that friendship goes back to World War I in 1917, when Roosevelt, then Undersecretary of the Navy, invited Tesla to do some work, war work for the government, which Tesla readily agreed to do. Tesla was, among other things, a patriot. He didn't believe in this country very strongly, and he did a great deal of work for the government. And then when the war was over, he became part of the new organization of RCA. There's a great deal of history for Tesla, which I could go into, but it's not germane, really, to the subject. In any case, they went onward with the research work, and by 1940, they had a fully successful test at the Brooklyn Navy Yard involving a small Navy ship, the Tender. And there were two ships adjacent, one starboard, one port, which carried most of the heavy equipment, and the balance of the equipment, the special coils and the antenna, were installed on the ship, which was to be made invisible. And the important point of that test was while it was completely successful, there were no personnel on board. It was completely deserted insofar as any people, any personnel of any kind.
So they made a smaller ship disappear in when, 1940?
1940. Late in the year, it was at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. With that test, they knew that they had a successful system. Everyone was elated, including the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and of course they immediately classified the project. Up to that point, there was an open research project conducted by the Institute of Advanced Study. It was not classified, and it was purely research conducted by the Institute with some Navy backing, Navy funds. Tesla was named the original director by Roosevelt in 1934. And Tesla remained director for this project until March of 1942. Now, there's a lot more history in here, and I'm going to have to fill in and let you know how I got involved in this thing.
All right.
I was not born Al Bielek. I was born Edward Cameron, and that was in August 4th, 1916. Somewhat at variance with my birth certificate is Al Bielek, which says I was born in March of 1927. I was actually born in 1916. My father was Alexander Duncan Cameron Sr., who was a Navy man. And he went into the Navy, since we can't find any records to show when he went in and when he went left, estimated in 1910, because he was born in 1891.
Why is there this disparity in your birth certificate and your real age and real name?
Well, you have to get into the rest of the story to understand why. There was no secret about my history at that time, up through that entire period. Nor my brother, who was Duncan Cameron, who was born about 7 months after I was. Same father, different mother. Father was shall we say, a ladies' man, and he had quite a few under his wing. 2 common law marriages at that time. The first 2 wives were not legal, but from that point on they were legal. In any case, 1917, the war became a hot issue. He was called by the Navy to go to sea, and he abandoned the 2 women. And we were both raised by Auntie Cameron in Long Island. Auntie Arnold, actually, is her name, married. And we never saw Father except maybe once a year. Mm-hmm. We both had the advantage of a family with money and a social position, and we were admonished by Father to go get a good education, which in the Depression years, of course, was probably the appropriate thing to do because there wasn't much else to do.
Sure.
So we did. We both acquired an education in physics, Ph.D. I first went to Princeton, then I was transferred to Harvard at Dr. von Neumann's suggestion because I met him at Princeton. Took a Ph.D. from Harvard in the summer of '39, and my brother Duncan from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, in also the summer of 1939. By Father's insistence and arrangement, we both joined the Navy in September 1939.
So you have a Ph.D. in physics?
Under the name of Edward Cameron.
I see.
Not as Al Bielek. I have to stress that because of what happened later. So we both joined the Navy. We were given, shall we say, a 90-day wonder school treatment by the Navy for officers who were for special assignment. We were given commissions upon enlistment. Lieutenant J.G., which was quite standard at that time. And then in January 1940, we were assigned to the Institute of Advanced Study, where we were brought up to speed on the project. We didn't know really what we were going to be assigned to, but we knew we were going to be on some special project. And that's how we became, both Duncan, my brother, and myself, became involved in the Philadelphia experiment. It was not called the Philadelphia experiment in the early stage. It was still known as Project Invisibility. Its correct name under the code name given by the Navy when they classified it was Project Rainbow. So we were brought on board at the Institute here in 1940 in January, and then they had the test in September, and then it was when they classified it and it became Project Rainbow. It was still Project Invisibility when we joined. Now after that, they set up offices in the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Of course, they had a lot of space there. And the classified aspects of this project there were continued at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and of course the project was also still continued at the Institute in Princeton, on the Princeton grounds. And the Institute was not part of the university. It was on university property, but it was a totally separate entity. And a separate control, separate financing, and the whole 9 yards. It was a separate entity. So the project was ongoing, and with the successful test, Roosevelt told Tesla he was giving him a somewhat larger ship to make invisible, literally a battleship. And he said to Tesla, if you can make that invisible, you can make anything invisible. So we proceeded to prepare for this. He had to order equipment, do a lot of further work. And I might add that at that time, Tesla was, up until 1939, still involved with RCA, and he only showed up in the project maybe once a week. I did meet him a couple of times. And he was ongoing still with his other lab research and lab work. I mean, he had not been a recluse by any means. I'll give you a quick thumbnail of what he had done in the period from 1931 onward, when he was the alleged recluse twiddling his thumbs in a hotel room. In 1931, he had successfully produced a source of, shall we say, free power, which was successful enough that he converted a Pierce Arrow automobile to an electric drive with a 75-horse motor under the hood and a little black box he carried around with him, plugged into the dashboard when he wanted to go somewhere and demonstrate this car and its feasibility. Drove all over New York City, much to the elation of the press, and there was a lot of press coverage at the time. Eventually drove upstate New York and all over New York State, and eventually the car was abandoned somewhere. I do not know the history of what happened to the car. He was also working on such things as particle beam weapon systems. He had a successful one by 1935.
Al, I've heard a lot of this about Tesla, and I've always wondered if Tesla had all of this incredible technology developed then,
yes,
what happened to it? In other words, what happened to the documentation? He was a scientist. I presume he documented his work. Why is it all lost, Al?
It is not lost. It was, shall we say, swept under the rug here in the U.S. after he died. It was not lost at that time. He still had his laboratory going. He was in communication with other governments and scientists all over the world. The particle beam weapon system is quite curious in itself. He offered it to the United States. He went through a process known as a military board of review. And they were, at first, in favor of it, but the final vote cast it out. They were not, in terms of the final vote on it, interested.
Well, that's Star Wars today.
What I was saying about Tesla and the particle beam weapon system, he offered it to Canada at that time in 35 approximately, and they turned it down. It was offered to England not once but many times from 35 to 39. They turned it down. And they offered it to Russia in 1935, and they bought it. This is not well known, but they bought a working model and a U.S. consultancy for $25,000 cash. And a friend of mine here in Phoenix, who had access to the Russian embassy in recent years, he checked that story himself, and the Russians admitted that, yes, they did purchase the working model from Tesla in 1935, but it was lost during the war years with all of the bombing, shelling, and everything else that went on during the war years.
Al, how was enough energy available at that time prior to nuclear power for a particle beam weapon?
Well, it doesn't use that much power. It used high voltage, 200 million volts for a full-scale system, lesser voltage for a smaller system. It did not require high power. It required high voltage and a relatively minor amount of power, because the output tube, which I've seen and do have photos, or I should say sketches from working sketches from his notes, showed a continuously evacuated tube, which was evacuated on a continuously pumped basis, because it had to have an open end for the discharge of the particle beam. And the full-scale system would have required 200 million volts. The model's much lower, but the voltage was a very low current.
Right, you say continually evacuated. I understand particle beam weapons are much more effective in space, where...
Oh, this was intended for ground use on the surface.
Right. In
space, they don't have that problem. That's very true. In any case, that was only one of the things he worked on. He also worked on a death ray system demonstrated in 1938-39 at White Sands Proving Grounds, and our friend had those notes for a number of years till they were taken, shall we say, by the government. Found out he had them in private holding, and they were removed. Now, he left RCA, then had more time to spend on this project and his own laboratory work, because he was still very active. And in 1940, the successful test, and then he went on to prepare the battleship for a test at a later date. Now, in 1941, the Navy tapped Duncan and myself on the shoulder and said, it's time you find out what the Navy's about, and sent us to sea for a year. It wasn't exactly a year. It was on the USS Pennsylvania. And from January of 41 until approximately October, we were all over the Pacific. And then the Pennsylvania came into dry dock for overhaul in Pearl Harbor. And that's a matter of public record. Anyone can check. And we were on liberty and leave. We went to San Francisco on December 5th. We were to return to Pearl Harbor. We're about to board a plane at the Naval Air Station in Alameda. And we were stopped. The naval captain said the orders are canceled. We were taken to a room and we were interviewed by then Director of the Office of Naval Engineering, Hal Bowen Sr. He told us that we expect the Japanese will attack Pearl Harbor within 48 to 72 hours. We consider you people to be too valuable to send back there, so stay in San Francisco, which we did. And we returned to the Institute in 1942. And of course, Pearl Harbor on December 7th is history. Now, we returned to the project, and preparations were well underway and nearly complete for the battleship test. And Tesla was having considerable misgivings about it at that time. He knew because of the extremely high power required, electromagnetic power, that there could be damage to dead sailors because the equipment was going to be on the deck and the rotating fields were very powerful, and any personnel on deck would be exposed to them, and he expected there would be serious problems.
And there's a good cliffhanger point. I've got an additional quick break and a couple of them coming up here, so stand by just one sec, Al. The Philadelphia experiments, what we're talking about. Al Bielek is my guest.
Yes.
You say that Tesla was having misgivings. I want to stop and ask you for a second about electromagnetic fields. I have a bad back, Al, and I had an MRI once, and I had a demonstration by the technician of the strength of the magnetic field, and it was quite incredible, very strong. And yet, other than being able to see inside my body, there was no measurable effect. Now, suddenly, in our modern society, we're all of a sudden beginning to say, well, maybe there is an effect on the biological human being from electromagnetic fields. You know, all the controversy about the power lines and all the rest of it. So apparently there may be something, but I always thought magnetics, as a general rule, didn't have any effect at all on flesh and blood.
So if it's a DC field, you will find little or no effect. The problem is if it's an AC field at certain critical window frequencies, these have been charted, of course, since that day and that period. The information is well known now. There are critical window frequencies which affect the brain directly because the brain is affected and is receptive to magnetic frequencies, a modulation in the magnetic domain.
But only alternating current.
That is correct. An alternating field, or even a pulsed field with, of course, the Fourier series of frequencies, harmonics, which attain to a pulsed train, you have the same problem. Of course, a pulsed output or a square wave output, you have many more frequencies than the fundamental.
Absolutely.
Now, that was only part of the problem. The other aspect is that high-frequency electric fields, that is RF fields, will also affect the body and the brain if it's at the right frequencies. The Japanese did a lot of work on this during World War II.
Oh, no, absolutely. In fact, at high enough frequencies, you literally cook as you would in a microwave oven.
Very true. And even without cooking, you have frequencies which will affect the mind and the brain. And the effect on the neurological system is not at the level of RF heating, which was the old standard in the United States. The Russians long since have learned better, and of course they do know better here now, but the standard used to be 1/10 of a watt or 100 milliwatts per square inch was considered the threshold of heating of human tissue, and that was considered the danger point, and no consideration was given to the biological effects of much weaker fields.
Over long term as well.
Long term or short term, the window frequency short term. Now that, of course, is modern data, and it's all a result of the Philadelphia experiment and with the aftermath and all of the studies that were made.
I don't want to get too technical on everybody, Al, but I would be interested, what kind of frequency range are you talking about when you say window frequencies?
Window frequencies, in terms of the human brain and magnetic response, you're dealing in frequencies typically below 30 hertz.
Oh, very low frequencies then?
That's correct, ELF.
Oh, I'll be darned. And I thought you were going to say just the opposite. I thought you were going to talk about 1 gigahertz and up.
No, RF, you will talk about high frequencies in the range of for the spinal resonance around 450 megahertz. The brain cavity resonance is somewhere, depending on the size of the cavity of the human head, anywhere from roughly 850 to 1,000 megahertz, or 1 gigahertz, which also gets into the range of the cellular phone and the problem.
I was just about to say that, these people holding these cellular phones up.
Tesla was concerned because he knew that with the amount of power that was involved that there would be serious problems with Navy personnel. He went to the Navy and asked for an extension of time. He says he was certain he could solve the problem, but he needed more time. And, of course, he received the usual answer at that time, was, there's a war on, you've got a test date and meet it. So he had the choice of going ahead and hoping for the best, or, as he did choose, sabotage the test, detune the equipment so nothing happened and nobody was hurt. And, of course, he at that point...
That was the first test, Al, on the big ship?
That was the first test of a big ship.
And he detuned the equipment, actually took it off frequency so it wouldn't happen?
That's correct. He deliberately sabotaged the test.
I'll be darned.
No one was hurt. And, of course, that altered his historic record of having an impeccable history of never failing on any project. So he did on that one, and he bowed out and says, the test is a failure, gentlemen. I have other things to do. I'm leaving this project. Well, question is whether he left voluntarily or had a little assistance from the Navy. It doesn't matter. He left the project. And it was not very long after that, since this was March 42. In January of 1943, he died, and that was on the 7th of January. But he was separated from the project at that point and turned it over to Dr. John von Neumann, who then became the director. Now, von Neumann looked at the projects, told the Navy, I'll have to look and see what went wrong. It didn't take him long to find out what was wrong, but he decided to avail himself of the time and redesign the equipment. And he went, unlike Tesla, who was an analog man, liked to use continuous waves with special modulation waveforms. Von Neumann was a man who liked to do pulsed work. In other words, pulse the system with energy.
As you would radar.
As you would radar, exactly.
Sure.
And he decided to redesign the equipment for that. The basic mathematics, the basic approach was still the same. And the basic approach involved rotating fields, a rotating magnetic field outside of a rotating electric field, both counterclockwise. And the equipment design involved some changes, and particularly upping the power. Von Neumann went up to a 2-megawatt power output with a booster on each RF transmitter. Well, I can't say a standard AM transmitter, but a standard transmitter of the day, which they were pushing the state-of-the-art because the output was 160 megahertz, which was high frequency in those days, but definitely within the realm of capability, because radar was functional in those days, and they were running a still higher frequency.
You say 160 megahertz?
Right, at 2 megawatts.
Oh, my gosh. That's a VHF frequency typically used by two-way communications. Police are a little lower, but it's in that area.
But those days it was in the radar range because it didn't go to 400 megahertz range for radar until the war was over.
Right.
And that was insofar as the RF transmitters were concerned, 4 of them, feeding a special quadriphase antenna. And I'm speaking of the final design for the Eldridge, which was, the antenna was designed by T. Townsend Brown. He had been pulled into the Navy in 1938 to work on another problem, namely the German magnetic mines. But he was also an RF man, and he made contributions to the project. Now, in the redesign by von Neumann, he decided that he wanted a ship which was designed from the ground up for these tests. So this was roughly in the spring months of 1942, and about roughly July. He went to the Newark shipbuilding yards, which were not far from Philadelphia, picked a number off a drawing board, DE-173, and gave instructions how he wanted the ship modified. Namely, we're not completely complete and finish the interior of the ship. We'll leave it gutted, put 2 rails along the bottom, and leave gun turret number 2 unfinished so they could drop the heavy equipment in. In the case of the battleship, and trying to outfit it without designing it from the ground up, the heavy equipment was on the deck. So he wanted 2 large generators for the 4 Tesla coils buried in the guts of the ship. They were 75 kVA each, driven by a 750 horsepower motor with 2 right-angle gearbox drives, and that's some pretty heavy equipment.
Yes, it is.
And that went in the hold of the ship, along with the diesel electric generator to supply power for the system, which was totally separate from ship's power. And that was a 8-megawatt monster. So they had some heavy equipment in the hold. And the ship came down the ways in September of 42, went into dry dock. They put the heavy equipment in board the ship, and then in December of 42, the ship under its own power went to the Philadelphia Navy Yard in the interior section, which was the classified work, and the rest of the electronic equipment was installed.
I wish to stop you for a second so that I can understand the layout of the fields again. You've got an RF field, I take it first.
Yes, and there's special mast midships on top of the highest mast of the ship. And this produced a rotating electric field because of the design of the rest of the electronic equipment.
Right.
And the field was provided by 4 transmitters. Each were pulsed at special pulse rates, which is part of the whole system, and a lot of electronics which preceded it. Now, in addition to that, you had 4 large chronicle Tesla coils. When I say a Tesla coil, not the full-blown type which one is familiar with today with a primary and a secondary.
Right.
But a single coil, which was round in a conical shape, narrow at the top, wide at the base. There was essentially 1-inch copper tubing, hollow and cooled. And it was a single turn, like a spiral, expanding, and was fed at the top and the bottom in cables from the generator. They had 2 large generators, 2 outputs from each generator, and these were phased due to the rest of the electronic equipment so that you had a rotating magnetic field because of the phasing of the generators and the associated electronics. So these 4 coils were placed on the deck of the Eldridge, 2 forward, 2 aft,
right.
And of course there were 2 in starboard and 2 port, and they were symmetrically arranged around the antenna.
Okay.
And they were driven with very high-powered current pulses. And there was a certain rate, approximately a 10% duty cycle, and frequency so that you wound up with a rotating magnetic field. Now, this rotating field was outside of the electric field in essence. And without getting too technical on this...
I'm still trying to understand. I'm sorry, Al, don't mean to interrupt. Was the RF field rotating, or was it a constant output?
Oh, they were both rotating.
They were both rotating.
At different frequencies.
At different frequencies, and not in synchronization,
They were in synchronization, essentially, yes, because one was twice the rate of the other.
All right.
They were both tied, mathematically speaking, in terms of the rotating rate to what is a fundamental number for everything on this planet, namely pi over 2.
All right. Okay. I think I finally understand.
Okay. Now, this, of course, was in the final embodiment of the equipment. The ship had to be outfitted with the electronic equipment and everything that went with it. Duncan and I were back on the project, of course, from January 42 onward, and we saw the failure of the battleship test. We saw the whole procedure for the development of the Eldridge, which at that time was not called the Eldridge. It was just a number, DE-173. It did not become the Eldridge until it was christened, which was in August of 43.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with the outfitting of the ship, and there was a lot of testing and some other problems. Of course, they never tested the full system until it was out in the harbor. They also went through the Navy and the Von Neumann decided, and the Navy concurred to have a special volunteer test crew for these tests, all volunteer.
How many were aboard totally?
In the final test, there was 15 sailors and about 6 officers for the test, and each of the 2 tests for the Eldridge.
15 sailors and how many officers?
6.
6 officers, okay.
And that was 2 of them included Duncan and myself.
Right.
As we were trained to run the equipment in the hold, actually, which was a control room on the surface of the ship, behind steel doors and steel bulkheads.
So you weren't able to see out on the deck?
No, not with the bulkhead door closed, which was a normal procedure while operating the equipment.
Right.
In any case, a lot of preliminary tests preceding the final tests, and Von Neumann started to get the shakes about the personnel problem himself about, roughly March of 1943.
Mm-hmm.
And he decided to add a 3rd generator to try and produce a counterfield. And that never worked. It could never be synchronized with the other 2. The other 2 required very special electronic...
What was the purpose of the counterfield?
To provide some kind of protection in Van Neumann's mind to the effects of the other main field to the personnel. The system never worked. It only succeeded in zapping a technician who was working with us in the control room.
He was going to try and nullify the field in a certain area.
Correct. It didn't work, and he consequently abandoned the approach for the third generator, went back to the two-generator approach, and was essentially ready for tests in July of 1943. Now, all of this equipment was aboard the Eldridge. There were preliminary sectional tests, and we were thoroughly instructed in what was to be done and how the procedure was, because you have to understand in those days there were no computers.
Right.
Computer was invented by Van Neumann, but at a later date, after the war was over. And everything was manually run, so that the concern at that time was to produce a field of invisibility which would be both optical and, of course, by 43, we had very good radar. It was developed in the years prior to the war, but it was almost unknown until 1941-42.
So invisible optically and to radar.
And to radar. It's only an extension of one or the other, because the optical high frequencies are a much higher electromagnetic frequency range than radar.
Mm-hmm.
Radar in those days was running around 160 to 200 megahertz. So the final test was, the first test, not final, was decided to be held on the 20th of July. They scrubbed it till the 22nd, and then they held it in the harbor of Philadelphia. There was an observer ship with a man running the test. The man in charge of it was a Captain Harrison, now dead. And, of course, on that ship was Van Neumann and other scientists and other Navy personnel. It was a carrier as the observer.
So he was at least confident enough to be on board during it himself.
He was on board the observer ship. Not
I see. Then he wasn't.
He was not on the Eldridge.
I see.
No, the only people on the Eldridge were those who were involved directly in the test, which included Duncan and myself.
Did they advise you of the danger of what you were about to do?
No.
No.
No, they did not. There was no allusion to there being any real danger, but there was allusion to the fact that there could be problems. And Van Neumann did not expect any kind of a serious problem. For those who have seen the movie, where they saw these banks and banks of electron tubes, that was quite accurate, except for one thing. In the movie version, they showed miniature tubes. In the real version, they were using 6L6s in the large glass bulb size.
6L6s?
Yes. And
I know about a 6L6. That was the first tube I used in my first ham transmitter.
It was commonly used for many years, that's true.
With a 6AG7 driver.
Right. 6L6s were used to drive the field coils of the generators, 3,000 of them.
Wow.
There was actually 300 per field coil. There were 5 field coils on each generator. Don't ask me why that configuration was chosen. I couldn't answer that one.
I'm very impressed, Al, with your ability to describe the technical aspect of this. I'm very pleased about that. I know a lot of people in the audience won't understand it, but I'm understanding what you're saying, and you're very impressive.
So on the 22nd of July, they were ready for a test, and we were out in the harbor, and we received command by radio to the radio operator to proceed with the test, so we fired up the equipment in the appropriate order. And they ran the test for about 20 minutes. And the ship was invisible to the eye other than for a slight haze in the area where the ship was. It was actually in the water, and it was totally invisible to radar. It just faded right off the radar screen.
Did that invisibility occur instantly, or did it sort of phase in slowly, or how did it?
Phased in slowly. It did not occur instantly.
All right. How would you be able to confine the field to precisely to the mass of the ship, Al, or did you actually take some seawater with you?
You took some seawater with you. That became the concern of Captain Harrison, because he saw a large water line, much larger than the ship, and from his viewpoint on the deck of the carrier, looking with a pair of binoculars, all he could see was a big hole under the ship, and it appeared like the ship was floating in air. That is, there was a big gap there. He couldn't see the ship, but he could see that he knew the outline of the ship where it should be, and the water line was much larger than the ship, and he couldn't see the bottom, so to speak, where the water was. It was a fairly deep section of the harbor.
Wow.
And he became very concerned that maybe the ship was floating in air. It wasn't. But to all appearances,
Sure.
there was air there, and he was afraid because of the way the ship was put together with the gutted interior that the thing would break in half without water support, so he ordered the test terminated after 20 minutes.
Well, let's go to you for a moment. What was your job? What were you doing?
Conducting were running the equipment. In other words, we had the dual responsibility not only of turning the equipment on in proper sequence, checking the meters, knowing what the basic physics involved was, but also, in case something went wrong, we had to diagnose what might have gone wrong and, if necessary, shut the equipment off.
Once the invisibility occurred, or that effect began, as you looked at your own hand, what did you see?
A hand. You see, the effect was not on board the ship.
As you look, oh, I see. So, and as you looked at anything in the ship, it too appeared as normal.
Internally to the ship and to anyone on the deck, the ship appeared essentially normal, except for one factor. There was a heavy haze around the ship, and that heavy haze was ozone gas, which was generated by these fields.
So for 20 minutes, this ship disappeared.
That's right.
I'm going to ask a dumb question, ask where did it go, and you're going to say nowhere.
It didn't go anywhere, as it was still there in the harbor. There was, in fact, even a test with somebody coming by with a launch to see if they could touch the hull of the ship. Well, they were a little bit far away, but what they found was that there was a viscous-like resistant field. They couldn't even get their hand up to their elbow into it. It was resisting any attempt to penetrate it. So we're generating a field of a very unusual nature, and that field was outside of the ship by a fair distance, depending on the power. And actually what you had was a toroidal field, and the toroidal field was rotating, but it was also bisected across the donut, like you slice the donut in half across the full diameter.
Mm-hmm.
One half of the field was above the waterline, the other half was below the waterline. Produced a very unusual effect because the end result of that was your rotating magnetic field was essentially unipolar above the waterline.
What happened to the biological entities, the people on board the ship?
When the order was given to terminate the test and return to dockside, there was no problem. They did return the ship to dockside. There were certain numbers of personnel stationed on the deck to see what they saw and what they observed. These people, these sailors, were totally disoriented, sick, nauseous, out of it, as the saying goes, and mentally very confused. They were not insane, and they were not in the state which happened on the second test. But in any case, the Navy says, well, it's no problem. We have another test crew, because they only took about one half of the special group of trainees who went through a special 90-day training school at the Coast Guard Academy, headed by my father, believe it or not. And they said, well, we have another crew for you, no problem. And so Van Neumann says, well, I've got to find a means to solve this problem. And he asked the Navy for more time. Well, they didn't initially give him a date for the second test. But what happened was that after about a week, they said, okay, you got a drop-dead date, the 12th of August, 1943. Complete your tests by then or forget it. Well, we couldn't figure out what the blazes this was all about. It made no sense that anyone had ever given such an order before. And I went to Halbo and I said, where did this order come from? He found out it came from the Chief of Naval Operations, who was Admiral King at that time, which made even less sense, because he was only concerned with the operation of the Navy's part in the worldwide theater of operations and running the war.
Mm-hmm.
Why should he be concerned about an engineering test? We never did find the answer to that till many, many years later. But in any case, came the 12th. We had a great deal of concern about it. Norman did not have time enough to make any major change in the equipment.
We're almost up to the news here, but why were your concerns greater about the second test than the first?
Well, we were concerned more about the second test for this reason. Captain Harrison had decided that because of what he saw through the binoculars, he wanted special additional tests run, like they put pressure reading equipment on the hull, inside and outside.
Let's talk second experiment. Well,
okay. To continue where I left off, they decided they wanted to do some pressure testing on the hull to find out exactly what was going on, have a second crew placed on board, which was to operate that equipment only, and they assigned a submarine to go under the ship and find out, well, what was going on with the waterline or whatever.
Makes sense, yeah.
So all of this was set up for the final test on the 12th of August. And we had the crew on board and everything ready to go, and the last minute, something happened. They pulled the crew, the special crew, and put them on the sub, removed the sub, and then told us, the regular crew, for the test, to go ahead for the test. Well, at that point, needless to say, Duncan and I were very concerned. What's going on here? We had that funny gut feeling something was terribly wrong, but we didn't know what. So at the appropriate time, we were given the radio command to proceed, and we had two changes. One, the Navy decided to relax the requirement for optical invisibility to just radar, because they decided, if you understand, in those days there was no lower end, no shore end, and none of the sophisticated navigation systems we have today, or satellites or whatever.
Right.
And if you didn't have radar visibility, you better have some kind of optical visibility at night in a storm, or you might be ramming adjacent ships in a convoy, because it was typically the way they ran across the Atlantic, was in a large convoy. And they were trying to thwart the German sink rate, which was then approximately 50% of the shipping crossing the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
So there we were, and we had orders to proceed with the final test, finally received by radio, so we proceeded and fired up the equipment. And for the first, to those observing on the outside, and at this point there were three observer ships. There was a carrier, there was a Coast Guard cutter, and there was a commercial ship known as the SS Frieseth, a merchant marine ship. Mm-hmm. The merchant marine, of course, was very interested in the system that worked. They wanted to immediately outfit some of their ships when crossing the Atlantic. So we had three observer ships. We turned the equipment on, and for about the first 70 or so seconds, everything appeared to be functioning according to plan, i.e. radar and visibility, but you could still see the ship through a haze. The ship was still visible, but not in the normal sense of visibility. It was shrouded, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, there was a blue flash, and the ship disappeared, waterline and all, and there was no ship in the harbor. It was gone, and I don't mean visibly gone, it was physically gone. And it was gone for about 4 hours. And then at 4 hours approximately, the ship suddenly reappeared in the harbor. And needless to say, von Neumann and everybody was panicked when this happened. And there was no way to raise anyone on the radio. There was absolutely no radio connection. The ship reappeared, and they immediately observed from the observing carrier, the principal observer ship, that there was something wrong. Part of the antenna mast, special one, was gone. There was some superficial damage on the deck of the ship.
I can't stand it, Al. Where did the ship go?
I'll get to that.
Okay.
And there was some visible crew running around like crazy, and nobody responded on the radio. So they had a special launch go out with a boarding crew. When they boarded the ship, they found out much more about what happened. They found two men buried in the steel deck. Two men were buried upright in the steel bulkhead. The fifth man had his hand buried in the steel bulkhead. He lived. He's the only one of the five that lived. They cut his hand off and gave him an artificial hand later. And absolute pandemonium when they found this. And those who were still on deck were insane and totally out of it. I do mean insane. And those below deck were perfectly all right, because they were shielded by the steel.
Right.
I mean, one man developed a problem of intermittent and uncontrolled invisibility, but probably due to flux leakage due to the saturating of the steel. In any case, a special crew was put on board. The ship was brought back to dockside at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and they had 4 days of inquiry and hearing what happened. So I made my report. I was there. Duncan was not. He was among those who were missing. And nobody believed my report. Van Neumann didn't believe it. But in any case, he told me, I'll talk with you later. They opted for one more test. Like the first test in 1940 that was successful, after replacing the damaged equipment, we'll be in the outer harbor of Philadelphia late at night, sometime late October, 2,200 hours at night, and run it on long cables, like 1,000 feet of cable to the adjacent ship to control it. After the ship was on station, remove the personnel. Mm-hmm. Control the equipment by remote cable, in which they did, and the ship disappeared, came back about 15, 20 minutes later. Equipment in the hold was a smoking ruin, and some of it was missing, so at that point the Navy washed their hands of the whole project. So it was scrapping it, put the normal equipment on board the Eldridge, re-outfitted for war service. That was done for war service. during 44 and 45. Sometime in 46, we put in mothballs and remained there until 1951, I think it was, 51 or 2, when it was turned over to the Greek Navy as part of the group that was ships turned over to the Greek Navy by President Truman. It was renamed the Leon, and believe it or not, that ship is still in service in the Greek Navy today. We've had feedback on it in the last 2 months.
That's an astounding story. So now, if I can...
what happened?
That's right. What happened? You were on board. Where'd that ship go?
What happened to us? That is Duncan and I.
Yes.
In the first 30 seconds, everything appeared to be normal after the equipment was operational. Then we noticed strange waverings in the tubes, and then some strange electrical arcing started to take place in the control room. Now, this was totally unprecedented because there was no high voltage right there and that could induce such arc over. But nevertheless, it happened. It was continuing. We tried to raise somebody on the radio because another change in the interim was they put a direct link to the radio transmitter and a receiver in our control room rather than going through a remote signaling system and a remote link radio tower, so to speak. And we raised no one, couldn't hear anyone, so we were on our own. And we decided at that point, well, this equipment's going haywire. This is not according to plan. We better shut it down. Went to the main control handles for the main AC power to the equipment, and we yanked on them, grabbed on them, tried to force them. They wouldn't budge. We could not break power connection. Conditions continued to get worse in the control room, so we decided, let's get out of here. Opened the bulkhead door, ran out on deck. So a sailor's milling around very severely. No one was buried in the deck at that time. And we got the bright idea, well, let's jump overboard and swim ashore. We were both good swimmers. So we did jump overboard. Now, I must state that at that point, we could see nothing beyond the railing of the ship. It was just a gray fog, if you will, a gray something. We didn't know what it was, but we couldn't see anything beyond the ship. The ship was still quite visible of itself, though there was a haze running around on the ship. We jumped overboard. We never hit the water. Decided we didn't know what was happening, but we started to fall and fall and fall through what appeared to be, or felt like, a tunnel of some kind, and all kinds of strange flashing lights. And eventually we wound up standing on our feet on dry land. Quite a change from the expected water landing.
I should say.
Dry land at night on the inside perimeter of a military base. There's a chain link fence immediately to our back. And suddenly there was a bright searchlight beaming down on us from what was obviously a helicopter overhead. We didn't know what a helicopter was because in 43 there were still play toys, things which Sikorsky was working on, selling a few to the military, but they certainly were not a mainstay at that period. Today they are a mainstay of the military. So here we were spotlighted by a searchlight, and MPs came out of nowheres. This is where the story deviates from the movie. They grabbed us immediately, took us to a building. In the building we went, got on an elevator. It took us down several levels. Elevator doors opened. We saw a lot of military personnel running around, and an elderly civilian came forward and greeted us and said to us, "I've been expecting you, gentlemen. I am Dr. John von Neumann." Oh. He looked at him and said, "You're who?" And I said, "I'm Dr. von Neumann." I said, "You can't be. We left him about an hour ago. He's a much younger man." He said, "No, I'm sorry, gentlemen. You're no longer in 1943. I'm 40 years older. This is 1983, and you're at Montauk, Long Island, part of the Phoenix Project." Well, we thought he was nuts.
Wow.
However, he gave us the grand tour of the underground base. We saw computers which did not exist in 43, graphic displays, large screen color TV, and other electronic apparatus totally beyond anything we knew of in 1943. So we were not only impressed, we were thoroughly distraught. Finally, we sat down and watched TV for a few hours. As we found out later, we arrived at about 2 a.m. in the morning on the 12th of August, 1983, on Montauk, Long Island. The base was at the extreme eastern end of Long Island on what is known as the Montauk Air Force Station, long since abandoned, but in 1983 it was still operational in terms of this project. So we watched color TV, which of course didn't exist in 43. And when you see ads for 747 jet aircraft and men on the moon and discussions about the moon landings and the Cold War with Russia and a few other things, we knew something was terribly wrong.
Holy mackerel, Al.
And a few shots of modern freeways and traffic jams and that sort of thing.
That could be psychologically...
It was devastating.
Devastating is a good word. Now, here you are. You jumped off the ship. You're on dry land, greeted by a helicopter with a spotlight, and you're on a military base, and you're in 1983.
Correct.
Oh.
We didn't believe it at first, but after watching everything, seeing the evidence, we actually went up during the daylight hours up above the ground on the base. They did not let us off the base, but we did have a look around. It was a very large military base, and it's still there, though defunct at the present time.
Uh-huh.
And defunct in terms of the surface buildings. That's another long story on the Montauk project. But in any case, finally Van Neumann told us, he said, well, gentlemen, perhaps you're convinced now. I said, now we'll have to tell you the rest of the story. He says, I've known the whole story for some time. I've had it in my records. Said, you will go back. We have to send you back to the Eldridge so that you can smash the equipment and shut it off. He says, we can't control it from here. It's still running. The ship disappeared into hyperspace and into a hyperspace bubble, which is a mathematical artificial reality. And it's sustained by the fields generated by the equipment on board the ship. And so there's enough fuel there to keep it running for 30 days if something doesn't break down. They said the problem is that this hyperspace bubble is growing, and we don't know what it's going to encompass, how large it may get. It could engulf the entire Earth. Now, if you remember from the movie, there was an allusion to this. That is the movie, The Philadelphia Experiment, released in '84. There's a growing huge storm, and the energy is growing.
Oh, yes, Al. I've got it on tape. I'm going to go right home this morning and watch it.
And he said, you got to go back and destroy the equipment on the Eldridge so I can return to the harbor in 43. And I said, well, that's great. Just how are we supposed to do that? He says, we'll send you back. And I said, and just how are you going to do that? He says, well, we have complete control over space and time here on this project. We can send you anywhere we want. So we scratched our heads again. We didn't believe them, but they did send us back to the decks of the Eldridge. And the Montauk project is another long story of itself. They did indeed have control of space and time, and that is another long total story. But
well, then we obviously have time travel.
We've had it since 1945.
Good heavens. And not just time travel, but apparently simultaneously through space as well.
Yes. Now, that's a much later development. That was the Montauk project in the 60s and the 70s. Actually, it didn't come online with that capability until 76, 77.
What I'm saying is that actually occurred with the Philadelphia Experiment, because that ship moved not just in time, but in space.
Correct. That was not intended. It was an accident, so to speak. The two experiments locked up, and he knew it. So he sent us back so we could smash the equipment. So we're back on the deck of the Eldridge. We go in the control room. We find axes, and we start smashing everything in sight. And eventually, with enough equipment, the lines cut and equipment smashed, mostly the 606 tubes and some auxiliary electronic equipment. The main generator started to wind down, and at that point we knew the thing was over. So we went back out on deck, and then, of course, at that point we saw the bodies buried in the steel. However, we still couldn't see the harbor, and one of the things that turned up was a younger brother by the name of Jim, who was 6 years younger than Duncan and myself, had enlisted in the Navy after the war started, wound up volunteering for that special test crew, and wound up in the second test, and he was dying in the bulkhead. His head and shoulders were out of the steel. He was crying. I went over and put my arm around him, and of course he died that way, and Duncan took one look at this mess and looked at me and jumped overboard and disappeared. He wound up back in the Montauk project, probably in '83. Records indicate, as we found since, that it was in '83 that he arrived. And that's another long story, but I will go back to what happened so far as the ship is concerned.
All right.
After Duncan jumped overboard, the fields collapsed. It took about 2 minutes because they had been building up for many, many hours.
Right.
Exactly how long in hyperspace you can't state, but in terms of time at Philadelphia it was 4 hours. So they collapsed. We saw the normal harbor. The ship was seen to return, and of course they sent the launch out, and so forth. And I remained with the ship. I made my report. I told them what happened, where I went. Nobody believed me. Van Neumann later took me aside and said, I don't know whether to believe you or not. He says, we're going to find out. So he built a time machine there at the Institute, a small but workable one. And the technology for that was very little different than what we were dealing with in terms of the invisibility experiment. So we said, you're going back to 83, and you're going to get proof and bring it back to me to prove that you were there and that I was there. Oh, he did. He sent me more than once, and I came back with proof that he accepted. So no more of that experiment, and of course he was satisfied. It went into a report somewheres, and of course October of 43, after that part was over, he was part of the atomic bomb project at Los Alamos. He made his first trip up there in late October.
I guess we could conclude then that the technology from 83 has continued. Surely that's not something they've dropped.
No.
So they have that and much more capability now.
Yes, and furthermore, the project, though it was scuttled by the Navy in 43, was resurrected in 1947 when they asked Dr. Van Neumann to resurrect the project and see if they could salvage anything from it and find out what really went wrong. In 46, of course, he was involved in the race with the British on building the first all-electronic digital computer, and he won the race, despite what BBC says. And the first computer was completed in 1952. The first working model is today in the Smithsonian, and there's a documentary on that. But in any case, the first one was completed, and he built a new system for the Navy, having solved the problem. In 53, they had a new test on another ship, and there was no personal side effects. It was declared a success finally, and of course, they reclassified the project again and put it under the code name Project Phoenix.
All right, an obvious question now.
Yeah.
If we have this capability now, invisibility, why are we building stealth aircraft? Why are we putting special skins on aircraft and corners that are non-reflective of radar and that sort of thing? If we have technology that will do that, or is it still to the degree that you could not fit it, for example, reasonably on an airplane? Or
no, they've long since solved that problem. Well, fitted for aircraft. It's used on the B-1 bomber, the B-2, which is a stealth bomber.
You're saying this technology is being used for stealth?
Yes, that's on all Navy fighter aircraft, or Israeli fighter aircraft, the SR-71.
Holy.
All of the large Navy...
Al, hold on. I would like to get the audience involved, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, I'll just finish that statement.
Yes.
That the large supercarriers have the capability, and it's even today down to a personnel size, individual backpack, belt pack, if you will, where an individual can become invisible.
Well, that's a disturbing thought.
Yes.
For the rest of us visible folk.
Who manipulated much of this technology, at least in the later phases. They did not in terms of the Philadelphia experiment, because that was a homegrown experiment involving the Institute of Advanced Study in the Navy. But then it got into the phases after 1947. You then start running into political considerations, the UFO problem, a group called MJ-12, and the secret government. And the secret government is determined to have a one-world government, the so-called New World Order, which I'm sure everybody's heard the term, promulgated by Bush and company. And this is the real gist of it. The secret government, they have control of all of this technology. And we no longer, as a nation, really control all of that technology. We no longer, as a nation, have the kind of authority and position we once had.
Do most people buy it, or how do you deal with the incredible aspects of this story? I mean, it is incredible. This beats most UFO stories I've heard.
Well, I think you could say that in many respects it does. Now, the problem here is that, yes, there are a lot of people who have never heard the story before. They have not read any of the material that's been in the open literature since 1955 dealing with the Philadelphia experiment. There's much additional material I can give you on this, but nevertheless, the movie was made in 1984. It was released telling basically the story, but a lot of Hollywood fill-in with a love story and the interest of running around Nevada and California.
They can't make movies without love scenes.
Right. None of that never occurred. The beginning and the ending is very accurate. The ending is nearly accurate.
All right.
But in any case, there is a problem there. If you have not been exposed to this, how can this possibly be? I agree with the gentleman.
To be hit with this all at once is rough.
Skepticism, but do your research. Eventually you'll find enough information that you'll probably agree that it happened, because there is information available in spite of government suppression.
Al, is it possible to change what occurs in time?
Yes and no. Yes, you can if you know what you're doing, but the point is they're more concerned with altering the present by looking at the future in order to make the future come out the way the current ruling elite want it to come out. Changing the past is more difficult. It can be done, but it's very difficult, and you get into problems of quantum mechanics and quantum physics.
I guess what I'm asking really is these world leaders that are, according to you and others, in concert heading us toward a one-world government, is there an inevitability about it in that it's going to happen whether we like it or not, or can we change it between now and whenever it coalesces?
It can be changed. There's no such thing as it being cast in stone. They would like to see to the fact that it would become inevitable from their point of view. That's why they're trying to change time and events by looking in the future. There is a project called the Project Looking Glass, which is a view into the future. There are other more complex machines today built from the 70s onward where they can travel in time as well as look in time. They have some, shall we say, some restrictions on that in terms of the future.